You're an actor, Mr. Washington. You don't live this life, you just rehearse it. The room didn't gasp. It held its breath. Denzel didn't respond. Not right away. Because some insults aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to be exposed. And in that moment, surrounded by polished suits and blinking cameras, he didn't reach for outrage. He reached for truth. Not the kind found in headlines, but the kind carved into kitchen tables, hospital bills, and folded eviction notices. Then calmly he asked a question. Just one. The kind that makes even the most powerful man in the room forget his script. The question hadn't even been asked yet, and the room already knew. Something had shifted. It was supposed to be a civic conversation. That's what the flyer said. A carefully curated event hosted at a federal auditorium in Washington, D.C., organized by a nonpartisan nonprofit with an aspirational name and a mission statement polished to perfection, rebuilding the bridge between the people and their public servants. But tonight it wasn't a bridge being built. It was a fault line being exposed. Mitch McConnell had arrived exactly on time, flanked by aides who moved like bodyguards but carried no weapons, just binders and silence. He looked exactly as the headlines remembered him, calm, deliberate, immovable. He was introduced with reverence. One of the most experienced minds in American policy, a guardian of fiscal discipline, a man who has dedicated his life to preserving the structure of government. The applause was polite, practiced, predictable. Then came Denzel. No entourage, no script, no security detail, just Denzel. Not the movie star, not the Oscar winner, but the son of a cleaning lady, the brother of a veteran, the voice of a generation that knew what the underside of policy felt like. He wasn't there for the cameras, though the cameras turned anyway. He was introduced simply as a guest speaker, a concerned citizen, representing underrepresented communities and veterans. The contrast was jarring. Mitch wore the room like a tailored suit. Denzel walked into it like a man stepping into someone else's house. Alert, respectful, but not intimidated. He didn't sit back. He didn't look for a stage cue. He stood at the edge of the platform, hands clasped in front of him, like he was waiting for someone to say something true. The audience was a curated mix. Think tanks, donors, journalists from the New York Times, Politico, Fox, MSNBC, a handful of undecided voters, and a front row line with expressionless staffers who hadn't blinked since lunch. Every angle was covered. Every word was live-streamed. The air itself seemed under surveillance. 2 men, 2 legacies, 2 versions of America, 10 feet apart. And when Mitch McConnell leaned slightly forward and delivered that line, "You're an actor, Mr. Washington. You don't live this life. You just rehearse it." It didn't echo. It landed. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of pressure. As if the entire room leaned forward, waiting for the script to continue. But the script had just been set on fire. Denzel didn't respond. Not yet. Because that line wasn't new. It had been whispered behind doors for years. It had followed every black speaker, every working-class voice, every mother who cried in front of a courtroom and got called dramatic for it. He didn't look at Mitch. He looked past him, past the stage, past the lights, and finally he spoke. Not to retaliate, but to reframe. And what came next was the first question of the night, the kind that wasn't approved in the moderator's prep notes, the kind that nobody in a suit wanted to hear asked on live television. But before the question came, before the heat rose, there was the room. The room itself was part of the story. The air conditioning was humming, but the air felt thick. Too many bodies, too much tension. Journalists had their pens half raised, not to write, but in case something historic was about to happen. And deep in the back, a man holding a small camera, maybe freelance, maybe just lucky, had the lens trained on Denzel's hands, as if they were holding a match and the whole stage was gasoline. Somewhere outside, the Capitol loomed, indifferent as ever. Inside, power was no longer coming from the podium. It was coming from the silence after an insult, and the decision not to meet it with rage, but with something far more dangerous. Truth. And not the kind you find in press releases, but the kind that wears a work uniform and bus fare in 18-hour shifts. The kind that remembers the price of insulin. The kind that still smells like mop buckets and laundry steam. The kind that tonight finally got a microphone. Mitch McConnell leaned slightly forward, the way he always did when he was about to lecture a room he already considered beneath him. He adjusted the microphone with surgeon-like care, cleared his throat once, and began. His voice was soft, smooth, and strangely calm, like a man explaining bad news he himself wouldn't feel the consequences of. America, he said, does not thrive on chaos. It does not survive on sentiment. What we need, now more than ever, is stability, structure, and the kind of discipline that has kept this nation from falling into the traps of emotional governance. His tone was rehearsed, his cadence near perfect. There was no fire in it because there didn't need to be. Mitch McConnell wasn't trying to move anyone. He was trying to reassure the room that nothing would change. He spoke in percentages. Unemployment is at a 5-year low. Consumer confidence has returned. We've reduced the deficit without raising taxes on working families. Every number rolled off his tongue like gospel. And if someone closed their eyes and just listened to the music of it, they might almost believe him. It sounded responsible, reasonable, even wise. But then you opened your eyes and looked around the room, and suddenly the numbers started to feel like fiction. McConnell continued, unfazed. We've made tough choices, necessary ones, not because they were easy, but because they were right. America cannot afford to be reactive. We must be guided by principle, not passion, by long-term outcomes, not emotional narratives. Emotional narratives. He said it like a stain, like something to wipe off a white shirt. He finished his remarks with the ghost of a smile. No applause followed, just a few soft coughs, a shuffle of papers, the distant sound of a pen tapping a clipboard. The moderator offered a nod, but even she couldn't pretend that speech had landed. It floated, untouched, weightless. Then Denzel stood. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't have to change the lighting. The entire tone of the room shifted just because he was finally speaking. He didn't thank the moderator. He didn't ease into the moment. He looked straight ahead, then slowly turned to McConnell. Your numbers are accurate, he said, but I have a question. There was no prep in his voice, no practiced smile. He sounded like someone who'd been holding something in for far too long and wasn't going to decorate it. My mother, he continued, has been cleaning the same elementary school in South Central for 40 years. She gets there before the sun rises, and she leaves long after the last kid is picked up. She's never missed a shift, not once, and she still doesn't have health insurance. He paused. The room didn't move. The camera lights seemed to dim. She's paid taxes every year of her life. She votes in every election. She keeps her head down. She doesn't complain. She believed in this system, believed it would eventually notice her. His eyes met McConnell's. So tell me, Senator, if your numbers are so strong, if your discipline is working, if your policies are lifting America, then tell me, why does my mother still live like she's invisible? The silence now was not polite. It was reverent, uncomfortable, holy. One question. That was all it took. Why, he said again, quieter now, almost to himself, does a taxpayer like my mother have to live like she doesn't matter? McConnell's mouth twitched, but no sound came out, because there is no spreadsheet for that. Denzel stepped back slightly, but his presence didn't recede. It expanded, filled the corners of the room, pulsed through the live feed, vibrated in the throats of viewers across the country who had mothers just like her. People who didn't need a political science degree to understand what was wrong. They lived it every day. This isn't about debt ceilings, Denzel continued, now addressing the entire room. It's not about market confidence or long-term projections. This is about people who have done everything right, who still get left behind, who hear speeches like yours and wonder which country you're talking about, because it sure as hell isn't this one. One journalist in the back lowered his pen. Another finally raised a camera to eye level, realizing this moment wasn't going to rewind. You said we need to be led by principles, not passion. But what kind of principle lets a woman work 4 decades without dignity? What kind of policy counts her as a number, but never as a name? The question hung there, and suddenly everything McConnell had said, the numbers, the ratios, the forecasts, they all started to sound like static because Denzel wasn't talking to him anymore. He was talking to everyone else, to the people in the room, and far beyond it, to the millions watching who had forgotten what it felt like to hear their own lives described with clarity, with weight, with something that sounded like justice. He didn't shout, he didn't cry, he just told the truth, and it cut sharper than any accusation. McConnell shifted in his seat, just once, barely enough to notice, but in a room like this, that was everything. Mitch McConnell didn't flinch. That alone was impressive. After all, he'd weathered scandals, shutdowns, Supreme Court fights, and 10 presidents, all without cracking his voice or raising an eyebrow. Tonight, though, something had pierced his armor. Not a scream, not a protest, just a question. A simple, devastating question from a man he hadn't expected to go off script. But he was Mitch, and Mitch knew how to pivot. He leaned in, calm as ever, gripping the edges of the podium with the practiced stillness of a man who understood optics better than morality. "Mr. Washington," he said, voice low and evenly measured, "with all due respect, we do not govern this nation one individual at a time. We legislate for the whole, for the greater good. We don't shape laws around anecdotes. We shape them around outcomes." There it was, the pivot, the language of abstraction, reduce a life to a story to an anecdote, and suddenly you don't have to answer for it. You just file it away under exceptions. But Denzel didn't blink. He let the words fall between them like ash. Let them sit there for a beat too long. Then, slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, pulling a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket. It was creased at the corners, worn from his hands like it had been read too many times. "I thought you might say that," he said softly. "So I brought this." He unfolded the page and held it up. One of the reporters zoomed in. The words were black and clinical, cold. "According to a 2023 report by Open Secrets," Denzel began, "more than 60% of proposed legislation introduced in the Senate last year was originally drafted by lobbying firms, most of them representing corporations based outside this country." He turned slightly, not toward McConnell now, but toward the audience. The press, the viewers at home, the ones who had stopped chopping vegetables or folding laundry and were now leaning forward with their remote in hand, but not pressing pause. "Do you know what that means?" he continued. "It means our laws, our protections, our wages, our rights are being written by people who don't live here, who don't raise children here, who don't bury their parents here." He didn't raise his voice. He lowered it. "And you," Denzel said, turning back to Mitch, eyes steady. "You signed them." McConnell's face didn't move, but something shifted behind his eyes. Not fear. He'd outlived fear, but calculation. His fingers tensed slightly around the microphone. One knuckle went white. "You don't work for us," Denzel said, each word its own blade. "You work for whoever pays you more." The room went still, not quiet, still, the kind of stillness that hums beneath your skin. Someone in the back whispered something. A reporter dropped their pen. The moderator blinked like she'd just stepped into a scene no one had prepared her for. Mitch adjusted his tie. It was the only thing he could do that didn't look like retreat. "Lobbying," he replied, careful now, "is part of how a representative democracy functions. We consult experts, industries, and stakeholders to inform policy. That's how it works." Denzel smiled, not kindly. "Stakeholders?" he repeated. "Do single mothers count as stakeholders? Do janitors? Do veterans who wait 6 months for appointments count? Or is that only for firms with checkbooks bigger than most school district budgets?" McConnell opened his mouth to speak, but Denzel cut him off. Not with volume, but with timing. "This isn't a policy issue, Senator. It's a loyalty issue. And I think the American people have the right to ask who you're loyal to. Because from where I'm standing, it's not the ones sitting at kitchen tables wondering if groceries or gas will come first this week." The room erupted, not in applause, but in energy. A surge, a shift. Cameras clicked. A few heads nodded. One older woman in the third row wiped a tear she didn't expect to shed. And still McConnell held his line. Barely. "Our system isn't perfect," he said, more defensive now, "but it has endured." Denzel stepped back, but the weight of his presence didn't leave. It remained on the stage like a shadow that couldn't be shaken off. Endured, he echoed. So has poverty. So has racism. So has greed. Survival isn't virtue, Senator. Endurance doesn't mean righteousness. It just means you haven't been held accountable yet. McConnell didn't respond. Not because he couldn't, but because, for the first time in a long time, he knew silence would do less damage than truth. The moderator cleared her throat, her voice thinner now. Let's, move to the next question. But no one really heard her, because what had just happened wasn't a debate. It was an unveiling. There was no plan for what came next. No pre-cleared cue cards, no PR-safe question passed discreetly to the moderator during a break. It came from the back. A voice young, unsure, but piercing through the fog like a sudden gust of air through a sealed chamber. If Senator McConnell has finished, the reporter said, voice slightly cracking into the microphone, can I ask Mr. Washington to clarify? If you don't like how things are, then what exactly do you want the government to do? For a second, the room froze again. It was a sharp pivot. Not hostile, not condescending, just blunt. The kind of question no one likes because it strips the room of performance and demands direction. Even Denzel blinked, just once, not from surprise but from respect. The question was fair, and it was honest. He didn't pace. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't, thank you for the question. He just answered. I don't want a miracle, he said, voice steady, hands still. I'm not asking for overnight reform or some shiny new program with a catchy name. His tone dropped a little deeper. Not louder, just heavier. I just want to see someone stand behind a podium like this one and say the words, we were wrong. He let that hang in the air like incense in a cathedral. That's it. Not policy, not spin, not a memo written by interns. Just accountability. Just one person in power willing to say, we didn't protect the vulnerable. We cut too deep. We looked away when it was inconvenient, and we were wrong. Somewhere near the front row, a cameraman shifted, as if the lens itself was leaning closer. McConnell exhaled. Not sharply, not dismissively, just tired. The kind of exhale you give when you know the script has already slipped out of your hands and the spotlight is warming a little too close to the skin. He took a slow step toward the microphone again. Mr. Washington, he said, his voice no longer smooth but sanded down by fatigue. You speak eloquently. You speak with feeling. But the truth is, politics isn't made for emotion. It can't be. He gestured vaguely, as if drawing an invisible balance sheet in the air. If every decision we made was based on who cried hardest or who suffered most, this country would have gone bankrupt 100 times over. We are stewards of structure, guardians of order. We think in decades, not in moments. In systems, not sentiments. He nodded once, almost like a teacher offering the final answer to a student he pitied. Then Denzel stepped back into the space between them. No aggression, just something firmer than that. Presence. And that's the problem, he said quietly. If every decision is made in Excel, then the country may not go bankrupt, but it will lose its soul. There was no shout, no grandstanding, just that word, soul. It hung heavier than any number ever could. For decades, he continued, you've balanced budgets while people lost balance in their lives. You've trimmed spending while whole neighborhoods were cut out of the American dream. You've spoken of stability while communities collapsed quietly, off camera, off script, off the record. He looked around now, not just at McConnell, but at the room, the press, the panel, the ceiling lights. And maybe that's why we're here, because someone like me isn't supposed to speak in rooms like this, because pain makes you uncomfortable, because there's no fiscal model for shame, and because if you admitted you were wrong, even once, the whole damn equation might collapse. That's when it happened, a single clap, near the back, crisp, clear, then another. Not a roar, not a standing ovation, just real. People clapped like they didn't know if they were allowed to. But they did anyway, because what he said wasn't partisan. It wasn't left or right. It was just true. Even McConnell heard it and didn't stop it. He just stood there, hands clenched, jaw tight, eyes not blinking. Because in that moment, even he knew this wasn't about politics anymore. It was about something older, something more dangerous to a man like him. Moral clarity. And once that shows up in a room, numbers mean nothing. The applause faded, but it left something behind. A charge in the air, like after lightning hits too close. The moderator straightened in her seat, eyes scanning her notes, searching for a detour that no longer existed. The room had shifted. Whatever script this night had started with had long since been incinerated. And now it was all raw instinct, live emotion, and two men who had nothing left to lose in language. McConnell moved first, not physically but tactically. His voice didn't tremble, but his words were tighter, more clipped, as though his pride had suddenly been placed in a courtroom he hadn't agreed to enter. "You're a talented speaker, Mr. Washington," he said, tone polished with just enough ice to cut. "But you're not an economist. You're an actor. You speak in metaphors, not models. You perform pain. You don't manage it." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was a scalpel, not a sword, meant to remind the room who was credentialed and who was visiting. But Denzel didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He smiled. Not the Hollywood smile. Not the charming, smooth premiere night grin. This one was quieter, sadder, a touch bitter. The kind of smile a man makes when he's been called just emotional one too many times. When he's learned to absorb condescension like a second skin. Then he said calmly, "And yet, here I am, still the only one in this room speaking for real people." The room tensed, not visibly, but collectively, like a breath had been sucked in and no one knew how to let it out. Then he turned to Mitch, eyes like anchors, voice silk-wrapped steel. "You say I'm an actor," he said gently, "but I'm not the one pretending to represent people I haven't spoken to in decades." The hit landed, not with noise, but with weight. McConnell's jaw tightened. His grip on the lectern stiffened. For a moment, his face, normally granite smooth, twitched, not a wince. Something smaller, something more dangerous, recognition. The moderator quickly stepped in, her voice pitched higher than before. "Gentlemen," she said, "I'd like to remind you both, let's avoid personal attacks. We're here to discuss solutions, not score points." Denzel didn't move, didn't blink. He turned his head slowly toward the cameras. Not the moderator, not the panel, not even McConnell anymore, but the millions watching at home. The single mother in Detroit, the retired factory worker in Mississippi, the grandfather in Arizona watching from a kitchen table still stacked with unpaid prescriptions. "I'm not making it personal," Denzel said, voice quiet, steady, devastating. "I'm representing the people who've never been invited into this room. People who've paid into a system that never paid them back. Who've served this country, cleaned its classrooms, bled for its wars, and still never got asked what they needed." He didn't raise his tone, but it sliced clean through the air, like a needle through cloth. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm not here for applause. I'm here because somebody had to show up and remind the folks in power what the bottom actually looks like." McConnell opened his mouth, closed it. 7 seconds passed. Not 1, not 3, 7. And in those 7 seconds, everything said before began to rot, and everything unsaid began to matter more. He had no comeback, no pivot, no quote from Hamilton or Reagan or some think tank in Arlington. Just silence. Not out of respect, but out of calculation. Because sometimes the only winning move left is not to speak at all. But the room noticed. Everyone noticed. The pause was the kind that history records. Because it wasn't empty. It was full. Full of the very thing McConnell had tried to keep out. Doubt. A rustling of papers. A murmur in the back. Even some of the press, hardened veterans of 20 years' worth of Senate hearings, were shifting in their seats like they'd just seen something new. Denzel lowered his head slightly, like a man bowing not out of surrender, but out of reverence. For the moment, for the truth, for the millions he carried like a weight across his shoulders that had never been cast in bronze or draped in flags. He wasn't here to win a debate. He was here to end a performance. And right now, The actor wasn't him. The moderator paused. Her voice, after an hour of guiding through tension, now softened like silk wrapped around glass. "Before we close," she said, carefully scanning the faces before her, "I'd like to ask both of you a final question." The air was brittle. No one shuffled in their seats. No one checked their watch. This wasn't the kind of question you prepare for. It was the kind that cuts the lights and holds up a mirror. "If you had to say one kind thing about the other," she continued, "what would it be?" McConnell didn't move for a second. Then he exhaled, not out of fatigue, but surrender, as if this question had somehow exhausted him more than any policy clash, more than being called out on national television. He looked across the stage, at Denzel, at the man who, an hour ago, he might have called an inconvenience. Now he looked at him like a puzzle piece from a different box. Same shape, different picture. He stepped toward the microphone, eyes still set ahead. His voice was steady but stripped of the political armor he'd worn so comfortably since the moment he walked in. "Mr. Washington," he said slowly, "knows how to listen to pain." A hush washed across the room, not out of shock, but out of respect. There was no sarcasm, no twist in tone, just a truth, reluctantly offered. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. That sentence stood there like a glass of water placed on the table of a man who hadn't been offered a drink all night. Denzel looked at him, truly looked, not as a rival, not as a symbol, but as a man. And in that space, something flickered. Not agreement, but recognition. The moderator turned toward Denzel. He didn't hesitate. No breath to collect, no dramatic pause. "He knows how to hide it." Silence fell like dusk over the room. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't meant to wound. If anything, it was the closest thing to mercy Denzel had offered all night. Because what he said, and what he left unsaid, filled the room with more gravity than all the arguments before. "He knows how to hide it." It was a sentence forged in understanding, a nod to the decades McConnell had spent shielding himself in systems, hiding behind procedure and party lines. A nod to the fact that to spend that long in power, untouched, unmoved, a man must have built walls so thick even his own grief couldn't get out. And for the first time that night, McConnell's jaw didn't tighten. It slackened, not in weakness, but in exposure. This wasn't a debate anymore. It wasn't even a disagreement. It was something stranger. Two worldviews standing across from one another, realizing that while they could never live in the same house, they had both somehow survived the same storm. One with the roof ripped off, the other with every window boarded shut. The audience was still, not frozen, transfixed. The cameras didn't dare cut away, because this was the moment you never expect from live TV. The moment when two men stop performing and just become human. No one clapped. It would have been wrong. Applause would have ruined it, would have made it too easy, too clean. Instead, what filled the room was something deeper, a low, collective breath. The kind people take when they realize they're witnessing something not meant to be theatrical, but truthful. McConnell stepped back, hands folded in front of him. Denzel didn't move. His gaze lingered just long enough to say, "I see you," before lowering his eyes, not out of defeat, but out of respect. Because this wasn't victory. There would be no winner tonight, just reflection. Two men, two Americas, facing each other not to destroy, but to confront. Because sometimes the greatest confrontation isn't about who yells louder, it's about who stays quiet after something true has been said. The moderator's voice returned, soft, ceremonial, almost apologetic. "That concludes tonight's dialogue," she said, but no one in the room really heard her, because the real conclusion had already unfolded. In the air, in the space between two men who no longer needed a microphone to be heard. No music played, no sponsor ads cut in. The lights dimmed only slightly, as if the building itself was unsure whether this moment was truly over. McConnell stepped back first, not quickly, not hesitantly, just deliberately, the way a man retreats from a battlefield without declaring loss. His face was unreadable, but not cold. This time, it wasn't guarded. It was worn, Not by the argument, but by the cost of something much heavier: reflection. Denzel remained still, hands at his sides, no paper, no notes, no expression designed to please a lens. He didn't need to move. The room still revolved around him, not out of power, but gravity, a stillness earned through truth, not applause. The two men exited the stage in opposite directions. No handshake, no wave, no stage photo for the morning headlines. One went left, one went right. And for a moment, it seemed that would be the end. But just as McConnell reached the edge of the room, just as the doors ahead opened, spilling soft hallway light onto the polished floors, he paused. He didn't look at Denzel. He didn't look at the moderator. He looked at the crowd, not at the donors in suits or the aides with iPads. He looked at the faces behind the cameras, the ones who hadn't spoken, the ones who were never invited to, but came anyway. And then, for the first time all evening, his voice cracked ever so slightly. "I will be reconsidering some of my priorities." No justification, no spin, just those words. Measured, flat, but real. The sentence didn't redeem him. It didn't rewrite decades, but it broke the pattern. And in politics, in power, sometimes that's the most radical thing a man can do. He turned, walked out. The door closed behind him like a final page turned slowly, without punctuation. Denzel didn't follow. He didn't nod. He didn't react at all. He just stood in that pale light, the ghost of a smile resting quietly on his face. Not victorious, not smug, just calm. It wasn't a smile for cameras. It wasn't the smile of a man who had won. It was the smile of someone who'd finally been heard, of someone who knew that one sentence, spoken in front of the right people, could ripple further than any law passed in silence. The room emptied, slowly, almost reluctantly, because no one really wanted to leave. Not yet. They felt like witnesses, and somewhere, deep inside, they knew they'd be retelling this night years from now, not because it changed everything, but because it cracked something open. The press didn't rush for spin. They didn't have to. The story had already been written, not by the mouths of politicians, but by the expressions on every face that left that room a little quieter than they entered it. No one had won. No one had lost, because this was never about victory. It was about recognition. That two visions of America had stood on the same floor, at the same hour, and neither one had blinked. They had collided and revealed what had long been buried beneath statistics, party lines, and well-lit podiums. People listened, and that was enough. In a world built on headlines and handshakes, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is listen. Not to respond, but to understand. This wasn't a story of victory or defeat. It was a story of what happens when truth stands its ground, and power, for once, listens without speaking. Change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers through the cracks we never meant to show. And maybe, just maybe, being human begins not with agreement, but with the courage to see one another clearly and to care anyway. If this story stirred something in you, don't scroll past it. Hit like, share it with someone who still believes that being heard matters, and subscribe to Justice Unscripted, where we don't perform politics. We unmask it. Turn on the bell, because the next story won't come wrapped in sound bites. It'll be real, and it might just change how you see silence forever. Now we want to hear from you. Which moment made you stop? Which truth felt too familiar? Drop it in the comments. Let's not turn the page. Let's sit with it. Let's grow with it. This dramatized account was drawn from the very real wounds and reckonings of our time. It wasn't made to please. It was made to remind. Thanks for watching. And remember, justice isn't the loudest voice in the room. It's the quiet truth that refuses to disappear. This is Justice Unscripted.